Hello, everyone. Welcome to the C.S. Lewis Foundation's webinar series. We're delighted to welcome you today for our conversation with speaker Joy Marie Clarkson on Serious Constant Desire, Joy in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. We'd like to thank all of our regular donors who make today's webinar and all of our virtual and in-person gatherings possible. Thank you also to Matthew Clark and the Sweet Airs who wrote and performed the song playing as you joined us today. I'm Amber Saladin. I'm the Arts and Ministry Director for the C.S. Lewis Foundation. Allow me a moment to introduce you to the C.S. Lewis Foundation. Inspired by the life and legacy of C.S. Lewis, we encourage and equip Christians to live out our faith within the world of ideas and the arts. The goal is for our programs to produce spiritually equipped and culturally literate Christians who are transformative in whatever area they may be called to serve. We meet in person in multiple locations around the US and the UK, including Lewis's home in Oxford, the Kilns, which we own and operate as a study center. Our webinar series partners with our in-person events to provide community and engaging lifelong learning year-round. If you'd like to go back and watch some of our previous material, you can access that on our YouTube channel, as well as some of our in-person lectures from previous conferences. Later, Christopher Howell will tell us more about the in-person gatherings we're planning now. So as we begin, I want to center our minds and hearts with God's word, and I'm going to read to us from Psalm 37. Fret not yourselves because of the ungodly, neither be envious of those who are evildoers, for they shall soon be dried up like the grass and be withered even as the green herb. Put your trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and surely you shall be fed. Delight yourself in the Lord and he shall give you your heart's desire. Commit your way unto the Lord and put your trust in him and he shall bring it to pass. He shall make your righteousness as clear as the light, and your just dealing as the noonday. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not grieve yourself over the one whose way prospers, over the one who carries out evil counsels. Refrain from wrath and let go of anger. Fret not yourself, lest you be moved to do evil. Let us pray from Psalm 19. May the words of Joy's mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. At the C.S. Lewis Foundation, we're committed to engaging the soul and the heart as well as the mind. And art has a wonderful way of sneaking past even our own watchful dragons. Today, we'd like to share a poem with you of William Wordsworth called Surprised by Joy. I know you C.S. Lewis Foundation friends recognize that title, but perhaps you've never heard this poem before, and Joy has asked for it specifically. Surprised by Joy, William Wordsworth. Surprised by joy. Impatient as the wind, I turned to share the transport. Oh, with whom but thee long buried in the silent tomb, that spot which no vicissitude can find? Love, faithful love, recalled thee to my mind, but how could I forget thee? Through what power, even for the least division of an hour? Have I been so beguiled as to be blind to my most grievous loss? That thought's return was the worst pang that sorrow ever bore, save one only, when I stood forlorn, knowing my heart's best treasure was no more, that neither present time nor years unborn could to my sight that heavenly face restore. Today's speaker is Joy Marie Clarkson. Joy is a research associate. Hello, Joy, welcome. Joy is a research associate in theology and literature at King's College London. She is the books and culture editor for Plough Quarterly and hosts a popular podcast about culture and theology called Speaking with Joy. She wrote Aggressively Happy, a realist guide to believing in the goodness of life, and her next book, You Are a Tree, and Other Metaphors to Nourish Life, Thought, and Prayer comes out in early 2024. And I think we just saw this week the cover of that, which is exciting. Now, I did a little digging on Joy, and I wanted to tell you a little bit more about her than just her bio. So I found out a few things from Joy from a mutual friend. One is that Joy loves bright red lipstick, and so I wore some today just for you. Another is that Joy loves Yorkshire Gold tea, slightly to the obsessive quality. And Joy, this was a wonderful thing to hear from a friend. Joy knows how to choose cheerfulness. And I suppose when your parents name you Joy, that is going to be your lot in life. But it is wonderful to hear that you have chosen cheerfulness. Thank you, Joy. We're so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for that very warm welcome, Amber. And I apologize in advance if we all start to lull to sleep with the enchanting word of joy, which I think we will have all said many, many times, both because it is my own name and because it is the topic of our conversation tonight. And I want you to know that, yes, I also feel strange about saying my own name over and over again. But I'm very excited to be with you all tonight and to discuss this strange and wonderful book by C.S. Lewis. So if I'm good to go, I'll get started. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you all. As Amber said, I am a research associate in theology and literature at King's College London. And my academic studies actually started a long time ago. And you could say they sort of started with this book. And when Chris invited me to come on the C.S. Lewis's Foundation webinar, I thought that I wanted to revisit this story that had been so important to me. So today we're going to talk about serious, constant desire, and about the theme of joy and the Great Divorce. Now, this is perhaps a silly thing to do at a C.S. Lewis Foundation webinar, but I thought I would give us a quick introduction to the author of our book today, which of course is Clive Staples Lewis, or Jack as he was known to his friends. Kind of his very bare bones biography was that he was a fellow in English literature. That was kind of his main area. He also studied philosophy, but that was his main area of kind of academic work throughout his life. And he taught at Oxford for around 20 years before migrating to Cambridge in the last years of his life. He came from a Christian family in Northern Ireland, but he had a famous conversion, which of course many of us know about, back to Christianity in 1931, led in no small part by his friends. People like J.R.R. Tolkien and O. Barfield had conversations that helped lead him first to a belief in God and then a belief in Christianity. But something that was consistent over the course of his life, both before he was a Christian and after he became a Christian, something he continued to wrestle with, was this concept that he called joy. Now, when most of us hear joy, we think of happiness or jubilance. But for Lewis, it had this very particular meaning. Now, I put this painting because it's famously associated with the Romantics and with the sublime, that sense of encountering beauty and evoking the sense of terror and wonder and awe and desire. And that was kind of along the lines of what Lewis was thinking about when he engaged this thing that he described as a technical term. So what joy was for Lewis was, and this is a quote from his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, an unsatisfied desire, which itself is more desirable than any other satisfaction. So when you think about this word, the reason I requested us to read that poem by Wordsworth at the beginning is that it evokes this sense of kind of longing and anxiety and sadness, which is also somehow pleasurable. It makes us keep wanting to long, right? There's this absent object in Surprised by Joy, the poem, this one that's grieved. And that experience of desiring the object is also we want to continue desiring it, because to stop desiring it would be to kind of give up on the valuable thing that we're desiring. So Lewis, this idea of joy, of the unsatisfied desire, which is more desirable than any satisfaction, kind of came to him experientially. So this is his description of one of his first experiences of joy. He writes, "The first is itself the memory of a memory. As I stood beside a flowering currant bush on a summer day, there suddenly rose in me without warning, and as if from a depth not of years but of centuries, the memory of that earlier morning at the old house when my brother had brought his toy garden into the nursery. It is difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. Milton's enormous bliss of Eden, given the full ancient meaning of enormous, comes somewhere near it. It was a sensation, of course, of desire. But desire for what? Not certainly for a biscuit tin filled with moss, nor even, though that came into it, for my own past." And that's a Greek word I can't pronounce. "And before I knew what I desired, the desire itself was gone, the whole glimpse withdrawn, the world turned into a commonplace again, only stirred by a longing for the longing that had just ceased." So this is kind of an experience he has as a child, and he experiences it throughout his life and tries to understand it and tries to think about why it felt so significant to him. He also associates it with the German word Sehnsucht, which can be translated as desire, longing, craving, or yearning. I put this quote in because you'll note that Surprised by Joy is in 1955. It's his autobiography looking back over his life, and that's in 1955. But this is the first prose book he ever published, and he wrote it 1 year after he became a Christian. It's a very strange book if you ever get a chance to read it. It's a retelling of Pilgrim's Progress in which the everyman character named John travels through Puritania, that's the name of the world that he's in, and encounters various animated kind of vices or ideologies of the day. So he encounters things like materialism, but also things like Hegelianism and Marxism and fascism. And he encounters all of these, and then he's finally, he's led by Lady Reason to Mother Kirk, a good old Northern Irish way of thinking about things, and then he's baptized. But the whole story is started by this kind of vision of these islands that evoke longing in the main character and that make him set out on his journey. And this was also kind of an autobiographical way of describing his own conversion. And so as far back as 1933, in his first book, he's talking about joy, and he says the experience is one of intense longing. The sense of want is acute and even painful, yet the mere wanting is felt to somehow be a delight. So Lewis says that joy is a technical term and must be sharply distinguished both from happiness and pleasure. Joy, in my sense, has one characteristic and one only in common with them: the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. And then he says, but joy is never in our power, and pleasure often is. So joy is this experience that he then kind of mines to understand using kind of the tools of Romanticism and also, as we'll see later, of Augustinianism, is this idea that he carries with him throughout his whole life. And it's the idea of the insatiable desire to desire insatiably. So joy is both the desire, but joy is also the object of the desire, which is to keep desiring, keep feeling the same way. Something else that plays into joy is a desire for the home country. This is something that comes up again and again when he talks about joy. And when you think about kind of that Sehnsucht, it's kind of a homesickness feeling. So in Pilgrim's Regress, it is about a journey through and return to Puritania. So it has to do with country, with home, with travel, with a longing that draws you out, but also that draws you back. You then have the kind of homesickness that pervades both his own autobiography, but also the feeling of joy in Surprised by Joy. And then there's this quote from The Weight of Glory, where he gives a very similar definition of joy and talks about the desire for our own home country. So he quotes Wordsworth here specifically. If Wordsworth had gone back to those moments in the past, he would not have found the thing itself, but only the reminder of it. And what he remembered would turn out to be itself a remembering. I think they're going back to his Surprised by Joy. It was a memory of a memory. But then he goes on to say, for they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. So the function of joy in Lewis is to kind of make you keep desiring so you don't stop at the things of this world itself. All right, now I've given this very long introduction into joy. How does it pertain to the Great Divorce? Well, first we need to talk about this strange little book. It was published in 1945, so 10 years before Surprised by Joy. And its whole concept is built around the idea of the refrigerium, which originally I think was actually just that Christians would go to the graves of the faithful who had died and leave flowers or refreshments. But Lewis took it to this kind of medieval level and talked about the idea of the damned having holidays. So the book takes place where these people from hell are taken in a bus, as we see here, up to heaven to kind of have a refreshment day. And they're offered the chance, they encounter someone who basically invites them to stay in heaven. And then as readers, we watch what happens, whether they choose to stay or do not. The title is drawn from William Blake, who was also kind of a proto-romantic. So Lewis is really interested in romanticism here. And Milton, he had this problem with Milton, where he says that Milton is of the devil's party without knowing it, because the only interesting character, according to Blake, in Milton's Paradise Lost is the devil. So he has this belief in the necessity of opposites of good and evil, but his whole kind of vision is the unrestrained pursuit of desire as a path to wholeness. So he believes that all desires, if you follow them to their end, will lead to heaven, hence the marriage of heaven and hell. There's no bad desire. So Lewis says, that's not right. I want to kind of think about a great divorce. Not all desires can be followed. We also have some playing into this of Dante. So we have kind of a Beatrice and Dante thing here, where the main character who is in hell is led towards heaven by none other than George McDonald. So he acts as this kind of Beatrice figure. So just like in Dante, Dante's led through heaven and hell by Beatrice. For Lewis, he's led by George MacDonald, who was a Scottish preacher and novelist, and famously a universalist. So he kind of got part of the reason he got kicked out of his post was a belief that all would be saved. And he's important to Lewis because his novel Phantastes is said to have baptized the Lewis imagination before he became a Christian. So what's interesting in this book is that all throughout it, joy is described as all synonymous with heaven. So you have joy as a word, joy or enjoyment, used more than heaven. But joy is often identified with heaven in the book. So the damned prefer something to joy, that is, to reality. All that is fully real is heaven. So there's this sense in which joy is kind of meshed with reality and with heaven, and yet also with desire. So joy, in a way, drives the narrative. So we have this sense that if we're looking on the left here with our little man, that he is drawn by a sense of incompleteness, grief, or desire, which draws him towards the mountains. And as long as he's able to become real, right? Because one of the elements of the story is that the people from hell are kind of they can't be translucent. You can't see them. And as they come into heaven, they become real. The grass is too hard for them to walk on. And so to become prepared for joy or for heaven is to become real. And the thing that's drawing them on, as McDonald describes, is joy, this desire. And throughout the book, the way that this is described and kind of explicated by McDonald is as a choice between the self or between joy. And that really has to do with kind of this idea that we find in Augustine of the incurvatus in se. So it's the sense that sin is a turning in on itself. Instead of having kind of an outward disposition towards God and towards love of neighbors, it's turning our own love and our own choice onto ourselves. And so for Lewis, this means that it's this attachment of our desire to specific objects for our own use. So if you think about when he says that pleasure is often in our control, but joy isn't. It's the sense of us attaching onto things and people as something we can use, instead of seeing them as this conduit that should stir up joy in us and make us want to continue desiring and pull us towards God. So this is a quote from that's said by McDonald to Lewis. It kind of sets up this idea of the tension between self-choice and the choice of joy. He says, there are only two kinds of people in the end, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. And without that self-choice, which is kind of a play on words, right? It's both a choice the self makes, but it's also ultimately choosing myself, my capacity to control things. There could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. So that's where we get the title of this talk, right? The serious and constant desiring joy will ever miss it. Those who seek, find. Those who knock, it is opened. So I wanted to spend these last few minutes together kind of looking at two different examples of the kind of drama of the choice between joy and self. So I want to start with this episode we see between a woman named Pam, who is a mother trying to see her son. And I'm just going to read you this section before we start talking about it. "Oh, it's work, is it?" snapped the ghost. Then after a pause, "Well, when am I going to be allowed to see him?" "There's no question of being allowed, Pam. As soon as it's possible for him to see you, of course he will. You need to be thickened up a bit." "How?" said the ghost. This monosyllable was hard and a little threatening. "How?" "I'm afraid the first step is a hard one," said the spirit. "But after that, you'll go on like a house on fire. You'll be solid enough for Michael to perceive you when you learn to want someone else besides Michael. I don't say more than Michael, not as a beginning. That will come later. That will come later. No, it's that little germ of a desire for God that we need to start the process." And she goes on, and then Pam says, "You wouldn't talk like that if you were a mother." And the spirit says, "You mean if I were only a mother? But there's no such thing as being only a mother. You exist as Michael's mother only because you first existed as God's creature. That relation is older and closer. No, listen, Pam. He also loves. He also has suffered. He also has waited a long time." So this scene ends somewhat ambiguously, but we can kind of think about Pam's choice for self or choice for joy. So there's this sense, as he's talking about mother love, this place in which we might encounter something kind of divine, something transcendent, that it can become this conduit of pulling us towards God, of experiencing something like God, or it can become something that we control and that we stop and that we use as something to kind of construct and control and bring pleasure to the self. So there's a sense that it's a closed-ended desire. When he says that what she needs is to learn to want someone else besides Michael, it's to not make this one desire an all-encompassing desire. But then he also sees that in this desire, there's a germ of a desire for God. And that the problem, this comes later, is when she says, kind of finally, and this is where the scene ends, "Michael is mine." So it's this inability to see the world as this kind of unfolding thing that points towards God. But that scene ends in hope, because he says, "I've seen worse cases be pushed towards God." And the interesting thing here is that Lewis is kind of augmenting McDonald's universalism, because he's saying that in even the worst, kind of most recalcitrant sinner, there is a germ of desire that could bring us to God. But also that's not just kind of this meaningless universalism. It would have to be a choice that the humans made. So he says, what she calls her love for her son has turned into a poor, prickly, astringent sort of thing. But there's still a wee spark of something that's not just herself in it. And that might be blown into a flame. So I also want to read you, just as we're getting towards the end, this description of something that is redeemed. And this is kind of the one picture of hope that Lewis offers us. So this is the man with the red lizard that kind of slithers and talks in his ear. And it's this depiction of lust. And throughout the scene, the angel or the spirit continually offers to kill the lizard. And over again, he refuses. But then finally, the man says, God help me. And then he says, kill the lizard. And then we're given this beautiful description of what happens to lust when it's killed. For a moment, I could make out nothing distinctly. Then I saw between me and the nearest bush, unmistakably solid, but growing every moment solider, the upper arm and shoulder of a man. Then, brighter still and stronger, the legs and hands. The neck and golden head materialized. While I watched, and if my attention had not wavered, I should have seen the actual completing of a man, an immense man, naked, not much smaller than the angel. What distracted me was the fact that at the same moment, something seemed to be happening to the lizard. At first, I thought the operation had failed. So far, the dying creature was still struggling, even growing bigger as it struggled. And then it grew and changed. Its hinder parts grew rounder. The tail, still flicking, became a tail of hair that flicked between huge and glossy buttocks. Suddenly, I started back, rubbing my eyes. What stood before me was the greatest stallion I have ever seen, silvery white, but with mane and tail of gold. It was smooth, shining, rippled with swells of flesh and muscle, whinnying and stamping its foot. At each stamp, the land shook and the trees dwindled. So this is supposed to be this vision that Lewis gives us of what a desire can be when it's transformed, what a desire can be when it's transformed into joy and toward joy. And so he has this beautiful kind of psalmic prayer of overcome us that we might overcome ourselves. So what should this lead us to think about? It should lead us to think about desire as something which, when it is submitted and baptized, and this is imagery he gets even back in Pilgrim's Regress, can be something that can lead us to God. But when it's not baptized, when it's not submitted to God, it could become this stumbling block on the way to God. So McDonald says to the main character, "Excess of love, did you say? There was no excess." And this is about the mother. "She loved her son too little, not too much. If she had loved him more, there'd be no difficulty. No. You must draw another lesson from it. You must ask if the risen body, even of an appetite as grand as a horse as you saw, what would the risen body of maternal love or friendship be?" So he's kind of giving this image of how powerful a very corrupted desire could be. And as I've already mentioned, he's kind of getting this idea from Augustine, right? It's kind of a whispered thing I often find in Lewis. And really, it's the idea that Lewis has, that Augustine has, of the order amoris, the rightly ordered loves. That all things, Augustine has this beautiful passage where he says, where did I find you? Was it in the taste or the smell? It wasn't, but it was also in all those things. You were shining through and beckoning me. So this is kind of the vision that Lewis presents, and the way that he interprets his own experiences was that as he learned to look through these things and not stop there, they draw them to God. And that's what we see over and over again in these episodes of The Great Divorce. So I want to end here with a passage from Lewis's The Weight of Glory, which speaks to this idea of joys that stop too short and the importance of desire and Lewis's understanding of what brings us to God. He says, "It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday by the sea. We are far too easily pleased."
All right. Thank you so much for that. That was an excellent presentation. And it's been a while since I think we've had someone talk about the Great Divorce. So this is a very welcome change of pace since it's been out of the rotation for a while. There's a ton to think about in there. I keep thinking about McDonald and the way Lewis presents him, and Augustine too, you talked about at the end. And so I would like to tell everyone, I'll kick us off here. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and I will get to them. As you think about what you're going to ask, I wanted to kick us off with a question about Augustine, because one of the things that's always interesting about him in Confessions is in relating to desire and to baptism. He famously gets baptized as an adult and is a little bit racked afterwards that he still has a hard time not sinning, but it's still something that he seemingly can't stop. Maybe he can get better, but he can't stop. And so it leads him into this interesting discursus about memory, one of the most famous parts of the book, where he's tying together memory is a gift because it makes us who we are, and it gives us our continuity of self. And it is through memory that we even find God within ourselves. But there's a downside, because we remember ourselves before. We remember who we were before the baptism. It cultivates our habits. So it helps us with the future, but it also burdens us with the past. So I was curious, how do you see Lewis interacting with memory and baptism and desire in a similar way or different ways? Does he help us with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you will notice if you look at some of the quotes that I read there, like when he talks about his first experience of joy, it's what he describes as a memory of a memory. And I think he actually almost thinks of memory as a temptation, which I guess in a way it is for Augustine as well, although it's a different kind of temptation. And for Lewis, it's because we have a tendency to think if we could get back to that memory or remember it perfectly, we could discover joy. We could discover the thing that we desired. But then I think in The Great Divorce as well, a part of what you see is he kind of gets all timey-wimey at the end. And it's this sense that each one of these choices, which are built up of tons and tons of habit, that each one of them is both the culmination of many, many choices, but it's also the choice offered to us in each moment specifically. So I think that for Lewis, there's almost a that we should advocate for not trusting memory too much, because memory can lie to us. It can promise to hold something that that actually isn't true, or it doesn't actually hold the full joy, but it can also be something that can hold us back. So I think there's almost an element in which it makes us, we should try to attend to God in the present moment, not bringing the past, because all moments are in this moment, as he says, and not trying to seek those experiences of desire in the past, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that always, it's such a raw part of confession, so it's an interesting thing to always take into consideration. So since Lewis himself also, converts around the same age as Augustine and has to wrestle with the same problems, it's interesting to see it manifest in the way it does in The Great Divorce. Ron Peachy has a question where he says, do you see the same choices for joy and self at the end of the last battle as well?
Well, I'm going to confess that it's been a couple of years since I listened to since I read The Last Battle, by which I mean listened to it on a road trip in Scotland. But I think this is kind of Lewis's, as far as I have read, his construct for thinking about what it means to convert. So I think that you do see, like towards the end of the last battle, these kind of almost cartoonish choices of self, I think, and then even with the kind of much maligned damnation of Susan, if you want to call it that. There's the sense that she's turned away from what would draw her on towards joy, towards the self. So I think it is there both kind of archetypally and in specific instances. I think so.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've read that one too, a couple of years ago. That does strike true to me as well. What I was thinking of while you were reading also is when it comes to good desire and bad desire, because I think we often will see this sort of desire as being an uncontrollable passion. It often feels that way. When we read, say, the 23rd Psalm and it says, I shall not want. We might sometimes interpret that as contentment, but also as a sort of impassibility, maybe in a way. And it's interesting to see that there is a positive affection that Lewis is trying to present of wanting. And I was thinking, actually, what I had read of his recently was his essay about writing 3 ways of writing for children, children's literature. And he has an interesting comment, the same kind of thing there, where he says, a boy reading fairy tales desires and is happy in the fact of desiring. So even seeing the world with dragons and with elves in it, even if it's scary sometimes, it fulfills this sort of desire that is a good one. And then he tries to split it. He says there are 2 kinds of longing. One is ascesis, a spiritual exercise, and the other is a disease. So this to me maps on, I think, exactly the same as what he's trying to present in The Great Divorce. But I was interested, especially in the disease one, because I think he was maybe getting at something like consumerism or consumption as a way of being wrongly ordered desire. And so I was curious, Amber wanted to ask about, where's Amber's comment about rightly ordered affections? How does that relate to our joy? Does it relate to theosis as opposed to and ascesis, like Lewis says? Or is it, and are the poorly ordered ones like, consumptive in some way?
Yeah. So it's funny because this also goes with his kind of conversation with Blake, because he wants to say that there are there are two kinds of desires, as to say, he wants to split at least into two. Maybe I'm misunderstanding him. On some level in The Great Divorce, it seems like he's saying that all desires that are for something other than the self can be good. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And that it's only this kind of sense of turning on yourself that becomes. And I think the sense of turning into the self usually has to do with control, or the ability to, like you said, consume or manipulate or find pleasure in a way that I can control. Because otherwise it seems like all desires in his vision could become good if they're baptized, except for that desire for the self. And that is this kind of vision of movement towards everything, all desires moving towards God or becoming like God. I don't know if that answers the question. Also, it's interesting. I find some of his writing about, because that sounds similar to in Experiment and Criticism, where he talks about kind of how a good book is one that will make you want to return to it again and again, because you're never quite satisfied, that you want to revisit it and find what was there. And that's like this continual thing, as opposed to a bad book is one that you kind of use and throw away, which kind of has that sense of consumerism where, just consuming it. So it's interesting to see that transported onto literary criticism and the way that you think about writing a story.
Yeah, that is a really interesting connection, because he does frequently talk about, I think he mentions how, like, if someone reads the Odyssey once and then just says, okay, that's done, that is a wrongly ordered desire, right? That this is something you're supposed to sit with constantly, and keep revisiting it. Well, so that actually leads then to a little build off of what Amber asked about heaven and desire, and how maybe these things coexist. Because I think a lot of us, maybe we'll be imparted this image either growing up from inside or outside the church about it being kind of boring, right? Harps and clouds and nothing going on. And so that's obviously not the way Lewis is trying to present it. So how do we find joy as we think about moving to heaven? Is heaven a place where all our desires are good ones?
Yeah, I think that's where I think you get something like theosis, or what the Cappadocians would call epictasis, which is the idea of like the eternal, I think it's actually defined as the eternal evolution of joy. It's like this continually refining and drawing closer to God. So it's not like heaven is a place where your desires are sated. It's this place where you're continually kind of evolving towards God and becoming more and more like God in that way.
It's very Saint Gregory of Nyssa, right?
Yes.
So if that's showing up in Lewis, though, then that's it. Because as far as I know, he was not reading Eastern patristics. So is this mediated to him through McDonald? Is that where some of these ideas might be coming from?
I do think maybe because McDonald has a vision of, so he's a universalist. Also, it's funny how in this book, to me, it feels like Lewis took all the people he liked, like McDonald and Blake, but then he just like made it so that he like kind of massages their views a little bit to where he's comfortable with them, because McDonald was a straight up universalist. But if you read something like Lilith, he was a universalist with a deeply like Scotch Presbyterian Reformed hellfire background. And so he says, yes, everyone's going to be saved, but it's going to be through this kind of purgatorial process of learning to love, and to, in the case of Lilith, learning to open your hand, learning to not to close your hand on life. So I think that would be coming from there. But I don't know the question about the Eastern. Maybe there were Eastern influences in his life. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah, because that does sound similar, like you say, Gregory of Nyssa or Saint Ephrem or something, or Isaac of Nineveh. Sorry, I meant Ephrem. They have similar ideas, right? A couple questions coming in the Q&A. Lee McCroskey asks about. So you talked about how Blake and how Lewis disagreed with his vision of his marriage in heaven and hell. But what about Wordsworth? We started the poem with Wordsworth in the beginning. How would Lewis differentiate his views on joy from Wordsworth's, or desire?
So I don't know exactly how to answer that question. But I could give you a small answer from Surprised by Joy, his autobiography, which is the sense that actually this experience of desire becomes less important to him once he becomes a Christian. So there's this sense that the desire to keep desiring it's not that it goes away, but that it becomes less important. So I think maybe he would broadly agree with much of Wordsworth, but would not want to be caught up in kind of the nostalgia, as somebody else is asking about, the not caught up in kind of the desire to re-evoke the feeling, which was kind of romantic fixation.
Yeah, because then that can lead you to maybe even a positive desire is not being ordered properly. And you mentioned there's this other question about nostalgia that Brian Roden asks, that Lewis names nostalgia as one of the things we misidentify as joy in The Weight of Glory. And I think in letter 15 of the Screwtape Letters, he says that the past is the most godlike, so maybe connecting us to our Augustine conversation, as it is static and we can return to it again and again. But it seems that is the very danger of it, as it lends us to want to control or bend the past into the present. So he wants to know, can you provide any insight into Lewis including nostalgia in our mistaken search for joy?
So I think that is, yes, you are correct. He sees nostalgia as a barrier to that. And that, I think, is that sense of thinking we can find the desired thing, which is fundamentally God, in something, and that something being the past. So nostalgia can take on the form of nostalgia for our own past. So thinking there was some moment where we had the thing, where we had grasped what joy had revealed to us. But it can also take the form of nostalgia for a time in the past. So he has this kind of fixation on northernness in his youth, where he really just loves reading all these Norse myths, and he wants to be northern, and he feels like there's something significant in the northernness. But the point that he makes in Weight of Glory is what we desired is not in any of those things. It came through them. And so we shouldn't be looking to the past with kind of nostalgia, but rather kind of facing forward and being open to how joy is revealed to us in the present and how God calls to us in the present. And I think there's also an element of nostalgia being powerful because we can use it to control how we understand ourselves, whether consciously or not, and how we understand our world, right? So you actually see things like nostalgia cropping up a lot in things like communism and fascism. You have a nostalgia for a past, because if you can use that memory, you can then control people's desire to make it real in the world. So I think that's something he makes a point of.
Well, even etymologically, it can kind of maybe be slightly dangerous, right? Because I think the root of it is even pain, is sort of the pain of thinking back, of going home, that this is, I'm pretty sure that's the way the roots come in the ancient Greek, which maybe means just its inception is possibly somewhat dangerous of a thing to countenance. To go back to your question, or to your comment about George MacDonald and maybe Lewis slightly modifying his belief system, that connects to a comment that Ken Carter here has made about, he says, I think it was Lewis in the introduction to MacDonald's writing, who said of MacDonald something along the lines of, if he dares to believe that all will be saved, it is because he dares to believe that all will repent. That sounds like George MacDonald. That also sounds like David Bentley Hart and some of the current writers of universalism. And so I'm curious, though, do you think Lewis is presenting MacDonald fairly to MacDonald's thought in The Great Divorce, or do you think he's changed too much to make him palatable?
I mean, I think the fundamental difference is that he leaves open the possibility that some people can finally and fully just say no to God, that that God will honor that choice. And I don't think that's what MacDonald believed. But it's certainly, most of it's pretty sympathetic with what MacDonald believed. I do think it's a very bold thing to put most of your arguments in the mouth of someone that you most respected. Like, it'd be interesting to think of doing that, like picking an author you cared about most and then writing a book where you made them say all the things that you believed.
Who would you pick if you had to do that?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah. Do you have someone you'd nominate, or is that too dangerous of a question to ask?
No, my gut reaction was like Julian of Norwich or something.
Okay, yeah. It would be good if it's not someone who's still alive, then that can be.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, and then I was thinking, I definitely have thought about writing short stories about Julian of Norwich, so I'm not one to judge.
Well, we will have to pay attention for that if it comes up in your, either in a future book or on your Substack. Michael Sutherland asks a question, to go back to when you showed the image of the romantic the romantic painting with the sublime. He says, I was trying to see the difference between joy and the sublime, a mixture of fear and excitement, or the sense of pleasure while being in awe of something. That seems like the quote from Pilgrim's Regress, and the quote is, quote, the experience is one of intense longing, though the sense of want is acute and even painful. So maybe that connects to nostalgia. Yet the mere wanting is felt to be somehow a delight. So would Lewis differentiate the ideas of joy and sublime? This seems then that joy and fear are always combined in some respects.
I think he would differentiate them, because I think that the sublime usually has some element of terror and of it's kind of amoral, if that makes sense. So if anyone's seen Miyazaki, I always think Miyazaki's presentation of nature is very sublime. This sense of like a beautiful thing that you love looking at that would also destroy you in a second with no second thought. And so I think that's kind of the feeling of the sublime. I don't think fear is necessarily, it might sometimes be a part of joy for Lewis, but I don't think it always is. So I don't think it's quite the same as sublime, though he does write about the sublime.
Wait, when you say Miyazaki, do you mean like Studio Ghibli?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, could you say a little more about that? I'm going to pitch it to an announcement, but that's interesting. It's not something that's ever come up in our webinars before, so
I think there is actually an article about the sublime and Miyazaki. But when you think about the way he portrays, so he's a cartoon animated film maker in Japan, and a lot of his stuff has to do with environment, and he has lots of imagery that kind of also that presents nature as absolutely beautiful. So you'll see like little tiny characters against huge, vast skies, but also as terrifying and terrible, something that can kind of consume you. So there's an article on it. I don't remember the name of the author, but if you Google Sublime and Miyazaki, it will come up.
We'll see. Maybe we can find that. Yeah, that's a fascinating connection, because it's not something I think we haven't talked about that kind of thing before. So here Amber's posting it, Sublime, and Miyazaki. So that looks like that probably is it. Thanks, Amber. So I'm real quick. I'm going to make some announcements, and then we will pivot back to Joy for a last word and maybe a last question if we have time. So real quick, I would like to say just once again, thank you to everybody for showing up, for all of our partners and volunteers that have made this webinar possible. Through your generosity, these webinars highlight speakers who are living the legacy of C.S. Lewis in higher education, ministry, the arts. If you'd like to support these webinars, we do depend on donors to help make this possible. For the work of the foundation, please consider joining us by making a gift today through our website, www.cslewis.org. We actually have a couple events coming up. Our big one that is going to be in October will be our C.S. Lewis retreat in Navasota, Texas. So it's in the piney woods outside of Houston at the Camp Allen Conference and Retreat Center. The dates are October 13th to 15th. And the topic is Remembering the Signs, Faith, Knowing, and the Real in the Silver Chair. We picked the Silver Chair because it's the 70th anniversary of its publication. It's also the 125th anniversary of Lewis's birth and the 60th anniversary of his death. So we wanted to have a conference that was focused on him specifically. Sometimes we do themes about topics and so on, but this time we're going to focus a bit more on Lewis himself and the Silver Chair because of its anniversary. So we'd love for you to join us. Like I said, it'll be October 13 to 15. You can check our website. There will be more details. You can sign up for our newsletter to get reminders about it. And then I also want to say we have more webinars upcoming. This is our first one of this season that we started after now that summer is wrapping up. And so we're still working out the details on some of the next ones. But in December, I am excited to say that we confirmed that Christian Wyman, the poet, will be speaking with us in mid-December. He has a book coming out. Actually, if any of you have read My Bright Abyss, this is one of the best memoirs I think I've ever read. And he's got another collection of writings and poems and memoir writings coming out in December. Let me put the link there. It's called Zero to the Bone. So I'm excited about this, and we're excited that he'll be joining us. So I'd like to, I think we have time for one more question and then a final word, because Brooklyn Arna asks, do you think C.S. Lewis's idea of joy and his interpretation of a similar emotion is his interpretation of a similar emotion to how Kierkegaard talks about despair? Interesting.
That's a great question. I am not familiar enough with Kierkegaard to give that a confident answer, but I will say that I think he is doing a similar thing in the sense that he is paying attention to his own experience and trying to and the way in which it felt spiritually significant, and try to kind of theologically and philosophically explicate it. So I don't know, because I don't know Kierkegaard well enough. You should go form an opinion on that yourself. But I do think he's doing a similar kind of existentialist thing, even if he's not an existentialist.
Yeah, even just the evocation of joy and despair as being related to each other somehow is really fascinating. So that'll be something we'll have to take up moving forward. So I'd like to conclude here by giving you a last moment to make a last word to our audience and to everyone. Thank you for joining us, and then we'll have Amber conclude with a prayer afterwards.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for patiently listening. And I hope that if you take anything from this talk, it is the idea of our desires not being too much, but too little. And may you continue to desire good things and to desire them fully. Thanks for listening.
So it's a great thing to start our webinar season thinking about ordering our loves and our affections. So I found a prayer from St. Thomas Aquinas that I wanted to read for us today as we finish. It's slightly long, so hang in with me, but this is called For Ordering a Life Wisely. Let us pray. O merciful God, grant that I may desire ardently, search prudently, recognize truly, and bring to perfect completion whatever is pleasing to you for the praise and glory of your name. Put my life in order, O my God. Grant that I may know what you require me to do. Bestow upon me the power to accomplish your will as is necessary and fitting for the salvation of my soul. Grant to me, O Lord my God, that I may not falter in times of prosperity or adversity, so that I may not be exalted in the former, nor dejected in the latter. May I not rejoice in anything unless it leads me to you. May I not be saddened by anything unless it turns me from you. May I desire to please no one, nor fear to displease anyone but you. May all transitory things, O Lord, be worthless to me, and may all things eternal be ever cherished by me. May any joy without you be burdensome for me, and may I not desire anything else besides you. Thank you for joining us today. We will see you. We've got plans coming for September. We've got our conference in October. We have plans coming for a webinar in November, and we're welcoming Christian women in December. So please be sure to stay on our email list or follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for our updates. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.